Well, hello everybody. Get out of the light. So I'll explain what all of this is about and a bit about myself in a minute. I think I haven't actually checked this, but I suspect I win the prize for the longest session title in the conference. So what I wanted to start with, if the technology is working, good, is just say a little bit more about what this session is about and also what it isn't about. So what I'm going to be looking at is why diversity and dissent is valuable, and particularly when working with complex problems. And I'll explain what I mean by complex problems in a moment. But the reality is that or dissent in particular is problematic. It's challenging. I don't know about your experience, but every project as you can probably gather, I'm not in my first flush of youth. I've been through quite a lot of projects, and I think all of them have been characterized by people failing to agree about what the problem is and how to solve it. And so what this session is about is how to sort of engage with that dissent and actually see it as a positive thing, and how to use it and how to basically build better systems that are more resilient by working with it and going with the flow. And I want to tweak the title in. You write these things 6 months before you actually get to do them. And in it, I talked about solving complex problems. The reality is you never solve a complex problem. You change it, you hopefully move it in a better direction, but it remains a complex problem and it keeps on changing and you have to keep working with it. What the session isn't about, and feel free to leave if you decide that's actually what you wanted to hear about, is around the ethical issues that if you like, driving us to look at building more diverse teams, more diverse working places, engaging with more diverse audiences, and all that related HR stuff. It's not that those things, I see those things as being really important, absolutely vital, and it's something that I've been involved with. I can remember trying to do a sort of unbiased recruitment process for an I set up a workers' co-op, and we were really keen on this stuff in 1982, something like that. Trying to be more gender balanced and ethnically balanced group of people. So all those things are really important, but that's not my area of expertise and not what I'm going to be talking about today. So this session came about for 3 reasons. The first reason was I spoke here last year on catalyzing change when you have little or no power. Anybody come to that? Okay, so yes, there's a bit of overlap, but hopefully there's a lot of new material in this. And at the end, somebody asked the question, I've got a boss and I want to do something, and he is basically blocking me, brick wall. And I think often, most of us have come across that situation. And the answer I gave, I wasn't very happy with. So I went away thinking about it, and essentially that was one of the reasons, and started to do some more research and think it through. And hopefully at the end, I've got a better answer that sort of hopefully pulls things together from the session. The second reason is that I'm somebody who historically, I hate conflict. I don't like arguments. I feel I always lose them. But through the sort of journey that I've been on, I've actually come now to see conflict as actually being, if executed in the right way, as something that's valuable. But it has to be done in the right way, and like to think I don't run away from it quite as much as I used to. And the third reason why I want to talk about this is that, again, as you can gather, I've been involved in computing since 1975, something like that. Punch cards. I remember I have programmed using punch cards. And Agile wasn't a thing then. A lot of the concepts, I mean, I did test-driven development on that project, so a lot of the concepts were around, but Agile came along and I thought, there's a lot of good stuff here, I really like it, but the bit that I had a real difficulty with was the fact that I felt it was silent on the issue of how to involve the wider organisation. You know, there was this on-site customer, XP was my first encounter with it, and then in Scrum, you've got the product manager, and basically this magic person was able to go out there, get everybody to agree what was needed, get everybody to agree what the solution was. And you build this thing, and then they'd come in and there'd be a 2-hour show and tell session. Everybody go, oh, wow, that's really good, and go away. The reality was, in terms of my experience, which we'll look at in a moment, was that people don't, as I've already said, people don't agree on what the problem is, what the solution is, and when you've done it, whether that solution is a good one or not. So that's what this session is about, is how to work with those sort of diverse views when people don't agree on those sort of important topics. And what's been interesting, I think, about this this particular conference is, I think, there's certainly in some of the sessions I've been to, I think there's been some of those themes running through some of the other sessions. So a little bit of context about me. So I'm probably, anybody else here from working in the not-for-profit charity sector? No. Oh, okay. Oh, one or two. So for the last 30 years, I've been an independent consultant, and my sort of elevator pitch is I work with charities and not-for-profits that deliver complex services, and I help them find and implement systems to support their service delivery activities. And you can see some of animal welfare projects, a big project with a group of organisations that work with refugees and asylum seekers, and typically they have novel problems, problems that for which there isn't an off-the-shelf solution. And I tend to get involved right at the beginning. Richard, we need a new system to do our case management or deal with all the calls we're getting about animal welfare or wherever it is. And I tend to have like a long engagement. So I see the whole project right the way through to sort of delivery and support. So basically I've ended up having to live with the consequences of my own decisions. Not always the most comfortable, but you learn. I think one of the great things about Agile is, and we'll come back to this, is that it's a learning experience. It acknowledges that you're learning as you go along. And typically those projects have gone, in some cases, across organizational, and in some cases have involved multiple organizations. Sometimes we've been involving service users as well. But the particular focus for me is about how to engage with the internal users, senior managers, right the way down to frontline staff. And typically those projects have involved culture, process, work change, culture change. And they fall in the complex domain. And again, I'll come back and talk about that a bit more. So that's me. And what I'm going to try and do in this session is sort of weave together 30 years of experience. So there'll be a few stories in terms of projects I've worked on or aspects of projects that I've worked on. But in the last few years, I've basically been doing a sort of retrospective on my life and doing quite a lot of, I've got sucked into reading up lots of different thinkers about how to work better. I mean, some of them coming out of the Agile community, some of them coming from other directions. And what I'm trying to do in this session is weave together that experience with a whole set of resources. I'll mention all of those. I haven't done a reading list, but if anybody wants a reading list or a references list, then I'm happy to put one together and drop me an email at the end, and I'll share that later if you want to follow up on any of the people that I've mentioned. So the starting point is why diversity and dissent are important, and why you need to listen and understand. So start off with some case studies, not from my own experience, but these have been major disasters. I mean, some of them may well have been before you were born. I don't know how many people remember the Challenger disaster, where the rocket that was taking off with the Challenger on board, it exploded about 2 or 3 minutes into launch. The Tenerife airport disaster, where a jumbo jet that was taking off in fog hit another jumbo jet that was taxiing down the runway, and that was the largest in terms of number of deaths. Over 500 people died. So a major disaster. The USS Greenville was a submarine that was practicing an emergency surface routine and came up under a fishing boat, and about 11 people, I think, died as a result. And the last disaster is, I think most of you were around for, was our friends Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng. I have a pension that is still suffering as a result of their little experiment. And the common, I mean, when I did the trial in this, I went into some of the details of what happened on each one of those, but I don't have time to go into that. But basically, the common theme on all of these was there were people that knew stuff that weren't being listened to or weren't involved in, and in some cases, in the Challenger one, for example, the team that was responsible for the solid fuel rocket boosters, which were the cause of the problem, it was freezing cold. It was unusually cold in Florida, sub-zero temperatures, and there was a known problem. And the team that was responsible for the design said, "I don't think we should launch." And there was a big meeting in the day. This was in the days of fax machines and conference calls that you had to book sort of 12 hours in advance. There was a big meeting involving 30 people. And in the end, they decided to launch with the consequences that happened. And the thing was, there were people in that meeting that knew stuff that had they surfaced that information, people would have gone, okay, well, maybe we shouldn't launch. And the thing that was the cause in all of these things is the one thing that Donald Rumsfeld didn't talk about, which is, when he did the sort of, we've got the known knowns, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The one he didn't mention was the unknown knowns, which is stuff that somebody somewhere in the organization or in the problem knows, but those that making the decision don't know. And a lot of this session really is about how to surface those problems. And again, as I've already intimated, a lot of that is about listening. I think that's all I want to say on that. So what I want to do to start off with is, as I say, I've been doing a bit of a retrospective on my life, and I'm just going to share a few things that when I've seen them, I've gone, oh, wow, that is just so true. It sort of has encapsulated something that was sort of half formed in my mind. And they feed into what follows, but these are the sort of foundations on which this sort of presentation is built. I've already talked about complexity. Anybody know what this is? It's a causal map of obesity. Somebody did an analysis. I mean, it's in the news at the moment with sort of issues around, buy one, get one free deals with rubbish food. And somebody drew, I mean, you can find this online if you Google obesity causal map. And this is about 10 years old, but they tried to sort of map out all the causes and how they're all interlinked. And this is a complex system. And it was about 8 or 9 years ago, I came across Dave Snowden. Who knows Dave Snowden? Okay, so he has a Cynefin sense-making framework. I was going to talk a little bit about it when I did this run through last night. I won't tell you what time. I was halfway through and I'd already run out of time, so I've had to cut it out. But basically, he, through Liz Keogh, who has spoken at previous, I found a blog by her, and essentially I discovered that complex systems were a thing. And complex systems is where you have rich interconnectivity, and I mean, this is sort of a classic example of it, or messy entanglement, where everything's linked to everything else. You change one thing and it fires off all sorts of things, and they change, and then they feed back and change the thing that you've changed. So you can't, there are rules, but you don't know what the rules are, and the rules are changing. People are learning, they're adjusting as they go along, and we'll come on to that in a moment. So you can't predict it. And so all the stuff that, in my early days, the sort of linear planning, Prince2, all of that stuff that said, we can plan out projects 5 years in advance, we can write these big fat functional specs and so on. Basically complex systems theory says you can't do that. You can't predict how these systems are going to behave. So that was the first thing. Is there anything else I wanted to say about that? Don't know. We'll come back to it maybe. Whoops, wrong thing. Jump to slide there. So the second thing, when I saw this, I just thought, this is just such a brilliant picture, because my thesis has always been, if you want to find out what goes on in an organization, the last person to ask is the chief executive. What you want to do is go and talk to the front line, because what you have at the top there is what senior management think is going on in the organization, and what's written in the procedure manuals. Snowden and others talk about it and say basically that what makes organizations work are all the informal systems. You go and talk to somebody doing the job and they say, well, I'm supposed to do this, but in reality that doesn't work. What I do is I pick up the phone and I speak to Y, and if it's, and what I do, it depends on multiple things. So you've got this rich whole stack of stuff going on below the surface. And the reason why so many change projects fail is that this isn't seen, this isn't visible. I mean, I've got a classic example of that, but again, just conscious of time. If there's time at the end, I maybe ask me about it and I'll tell you the story. So that was the second thing I saw, and I thought, yep, that is so true. The third thing, I think most of you are probably familiar with, adoption curves. And we all know that, there's a bunch of people that you show them something new and they go, oh, wow, yes, love it, and just get it immediately. But there's a bunch of people down here who find change really difficult. And most of the stuff I've seen on change, I mean, a lot of change things is all about the, bells and whistles, balloons and streamers and things. It's about trying to sort of gee people up to say, isn't this wonderful? And there are a couple of things to say about this. I mean, one is that these people often, it's again, the reason why change is resisted is not because necessarily people don't like it, it's because of that previous slide. Basically, there's a stack of stuff that, the people who want to change things don't know about. And when they say, we've got this brilliant new idea for doing things, the reality is these people are going, that's not going to work because of X, Y, and Z. But the other thing, somebody whose work I came across recently is a woman called Karen Stenmer, and her work is contentious, but it is apparently research-based. I've not actually gone to the original sources, but what she says is there's about a third of the population, she's written a book called The Authoritarian Disposition. About a third of the population actually genetically find change difficult, find difference difficult. And I mean, you can see that in terms of, and the way they react to it is either is fear, and that fear often leads to massive hostility. And I think if you are to bring about change in the context within which you work, you need to be thinking about that group and treating them sympathetically, because it's potentially very damaging to them. And this one is something I came across more recently from a guy called Ed Morrison, and he has a methodology that I'm still researching. Oh, I know one thing I was going to say, I've skipped over, is that I am on a journey with complexity. I'm still learning a lot. There's the apprentice master model. sorry for the gender bias there, but I mean, from the olden days. But in the middle, there was something called a journeyman, and he basically travelled from, once you had completed your apprenticeship, you went on a journey and you travelled from master to master, sort of building your skills and honing your skills. And I feel I'm at that stage. I've done the early steps, I've completed my apprenticeship, but I'm still on a big learning journey. And then what I'm trying to do is sort of share some of the different experts that I've come across. And one that I've come across recently is this guy, Ed Morrison. He has a methodology, strategic doing, which has come out of urban. He works with deprived urban communities. And for me, when I saw this, I thought, this is what I've been doing, but didn't have this model in my head, that it's the power of networks. That if you've got a small group of people who are respected within the organisation, you work with them, you build new ideas, they go out and talk to the people that they work with, and because they're respected, they enthuse them, and they're also getting feedback. And that group of people then goes out and talks to the people they work with, their friends, and again enthuse, bring about change. So you get this sort of impact curve, essentially, that things spread out. Highly recommend his work. He hasn't come out of the Agile community, but he's arrived in a very similar place to the Agile community. Right, so just a little bit more on complexity. There's a guy called Jerry. When I started out a long time ago, there was a guy called, one of the early gurus, a guy called Jerry Weinberg, and he wrote a book on consulting, and his second law of consulting was, no matter how it looks at first, it's always a people problem. Yeah, and I think, yeah, if you look at why projects fail, things like organizational politics, internal communications often come very high on the list. And if the project, the reason we're doing tech projects is to bring about change, and if you're bringing about change, that's going to impact on people, and anything involving people is going to be complex, and particularly, and if you've got groups of people, it's even more complex. So the good news is that working with complex problems is not complex. There are a set of principles. I mean, these are predominantly from Snowden, and I think are worth quickly going through. Key thing about complex problems is their context is critical. What works in one situation doesn't work in another. And that's why things like best practice and so on, to use a technical term, are bollocks and not very helpful if you're working with a complex problem. I'll come back to that in a moment. And what's interesting is that if you look at this, I mean, there's quite a lot of overlap with what Jeff was saying yesterday. You know, you start off by setting a broad goal, big picture. You work out where you are at the moment. That's a key first step. And then one of the key things about complex systems is they're what Snowden calls dispositional. You can move them more easily in one direction than you can in another. And one of the things you can achieve through the techniques, the listening thing, is you can start to work out, actually, if we do this, that's going to be easier than if we do that. One technique that does work is you can take ideas from one place and you adapt them to your current context. It's called exaptation. You know, Snowden never uses a simple word when he can find one that you've never heard of. But it's a story of the microwave. Radar guy with a chocolate bar in his pocket. Engineer noticed the chocolate bar had melted. Radar uses microwaves and thought maybe we could put a microwave in a box and use it to heat up food. It's taking an idea from one place and reusing it, changing it, and using it in a different context. Design small, safe to fail experiments. That's the core of what Agile is about. I don't think I need to say any more on that. Look for weak signals. The key thing is working successfully with, these are the get this right, unknown knowns. You know, this is fundamental to working with complex problems. It's picking up on the small stories, the small signals that you need to, that tell you whether what you're doing is right and are giving you clues as to where you go next. The problem with complex problems and this way of working is that it means you don't know what the solution is at the start, and a lot of, particularly senior managers, find that really difficult. So I need to stop talking or talk more quickly, but this is important. Again, classic Agile stuff, learn from what works and what doesn't work, adjust goals in the light of experience. And there's this concept that the solution will emerge. And now when I pitch, I'm winding down in terms of my conventional work, but when I go in, I say, I don't know what the solution is, but I have ways of finding out. And the solution will emerge. And for some people, they don't feel comfortable with that, and we go our separate ways. Basically, I think one of the things that senior managers need to do in the world that we live in now is to learn to live with uncertainty and these techniques. Whoops, what have I done? So I've already touched on this. So yes, if you're not listening to the groups that know stuff, you're not picking up the unknown knowns. You're not then able to work anywhere near so effectively with the complex problem that you're facing. You're not picking up the weak signals. And also those people have got good ideas in terms of how we can solve problems. And if you're not engaging with them, you're missing out on that. But the more people you involve, the more challenging it becomes, because by and large, unless my experience has been unique, those people won't agree. And so the question then comes, how do we work with that dissent? And that's really the focus of the rest of this session. So the starting point is, I'll start with the bad news. Anybody read this book or come across it, Poles Apart? It's a really interesting but depressing read. It's written more about the political situation. We live in an increasingly divided world, and it's very well researched. It's come out of their political advisors and specialists and so on that have written this. And I've just picked out a few things. I mean, the key thing is that if you're talking to somebody that you don't agree with, the last thing that's going to get them to change their mind are facts. The more you argue with somebody, the more they become embedded in their existing view. Groupthink is an incredibly powerful thing for human beings. Again, I don't have time. There's studies that have been done where you get people to do stuff in a group, and people will accept stuff that's clearly wrong if the rest of the group is saying that's how things are. We judge people on the basis of the group they belong to. We don't listen. We listen to argue. We listen to respond, and I'll come back to this. Cognitive bias dominates. We all know about. Cognitive bias is there for a good reason. It enables us to make decisions quickly when we need to for low energy cost. It has an important role to play. But as somebody said, even professors of cognitive bias suffer from cognitive bias. You can't get rid of it, but you need to be aware of it. And we are very resistant to change. I mean, one exercise that you might want to do after this session is just think, when did I last change my mind? As human beings, we resist change. We believe we are right. And one of the particular contexts within which you get resistance to change, and this comes from the work of Mary Albeen around adaptive space, which we'll come back to in a moment, is in organizations where you've got, on the right-hand side, you've got people, which are probably us, who are coming up with new ideas. But you've got the people doing the day job, the business as usual people. And normally what you have is, when the people coming up with the ideas go, we've got a much better idea for how you could be doing stuff. The people who are actually doing the work go, that's not going to work. And for a variety of reasons, partly because they're focused on the day job, partly because the people that tend to do those sorts of very important operational activities tend to be, if you remember the adoption curve, they tend to be up that end. They tend to feel more comfortable with the routine, and find change difficult. So we've got a problem in terms of changing people's minds. So this is the rest of the presentation, which I've got 10 minutes in which to do. So that's the bad news. Yeah. And as I say, the slides are available. I've put all the names of the people. I mean, by and large, if you Google the person and the text that goes with it, you'll find stuff on them, you know, YouTube videos, blog posts, etc. So a bit more on adaptive spaces. This is something when I saw it, Mary Albeen, if you Google her, there's some really good videos. So what she says is you've got this conflict between the people coming up with the ideas on the one side and the people who are doing the day job on the other. And she says what you need, historically, when you get that conflict, it gets suppressed. And again, you're losing stuff because of that. What she argues is that you actually need to allow that conflict to continue because it's giving you valuable information. But what you need to do is find connections as well. And by finding those connections, you're starting to identify solutions. And out of those solutions start to emerge. That gives you your adaptability. And that, you know, in the current environment in which we're living, you know, as an organization, you need to survive. The only way you're going to survive is by being adaptable. Interesting statistic that even Ford, when he invented the production line, the commercial benefit of that only lasted 6 years before others started copying it and doing it better. So even in the 1920s, you couldn't live for very long just doing the same thing. You have to be able to adapt to the world as it changes around you. And what Mary Albeen and Michael Arena, who is the other person she worked with on this, says is that what you need to be able to do, I mean, there's much more detail if you Google, is basically when you've got that conflict, and in order to achieve this connecting process, you need to create what she calls an adaptive space, where you bring the two groups together and you create small-scale experiments. And I mean, in the subsequent slides, I'll talk a bit more about some of the activities that and essentially the key thing is you've got this, you know, solutions emerging. And because you're involving people in the production space from the early stages, they're getting involved, you're picking up on the weak signals, they're involved in the design, you're doing the co-design stuff that we talked about yesterday. They're involved. So not only are you building better systems because you're getting their expertise and knowledge, but you're getting their support as well because they can see the solutions, you know, they can see their involvement in the solutions. And so you're reducing the amount of resistance that you'll see when you roll those systems out. So let's look at a bit more at what goes on in that space. Michael Arena, the other sort of originator of this, says that what we need to be doing as organizations is moving away from building human capital, I don't particularly like that term, to building social capital. It's about actually actively building networks within the organization by bringing people together. And I won't go into the detail of this. If you Google him, you'll find blog posts, etc., which a lot of this is nicked from. And he's got a book as well. But he says there are different types of connections that you need to be actively building. Discovery connections to help you find stuff and create new ideas by connecting stuff that's going on in different places. You still need your sort of coherent development team they need to be diverse internally, but they're sort of inward focused. They need to build very high bandwidth communication. And the diffusion connections, which is where you start to diffuse the new ideas back out into the wider organization. And he talks about energizers. And then you need disruptors who can break down those brick walls. Again, I can map that onto one of my projects, but I'm rapidly running out of time here. The Poles Apart book is good because it not only talks about the problems, it does start to look at things that are known to work. A lot of the stuff that she talks about, or they talk about, will come up later in the presentation, but there was one thing that only she talks about, is the illusion. illusion of explanatory depth, which is basically that people think they understand a problem better than they do. So if you ask them to explain why it is they hold the view that, I don't know, local traffic neighbourhoods, which is a big thing in my area, you know, why they're a bad thing, as they start to explain it, they start to realise, actually, what I'm saying doesn't make quite as much sense as I thought it did. And you start to introduce some uncertainty, and that's the sort of, that's seeding the pearl in terms of, you know, potentially bringing about change. Likability, I'll do this very quickly. Basically, if people like you, they would, you know, do more for you generally. I mean, the study's been done with doctors and patients, and if your doctor likes you, they will do a lot more for you. And this book is a bit sort of, you know, what's it called? Sort of self-improvement-y, sort of American, but it's based on some, what seems like some very sound research, that if you work on being likable, again, people will do more for you. And I think there's one particular thing on here, they will share more with you. Again, you're surfacing, they'll tell you stories that they wouldn't otherwise tell you. Tim Sanders, and his book is called The Likability Factor. Active listening, this is from Celeste Headley, We Need to Talk, and this is a lovely book. I've only read it recently, but I've learned an enormous amount from it. And you know, we basically listen to respond rather than listen to understand. And I'm going to get another card in a moment. So you know, her advice is, you know, basically learn to ignore your own thoughts. You know, that you hear something and your mind is running. And it's linked to mindfulness, essentially, learning to focus on what the person is saying. And there's some particular friends I've got who, when you're talking to them, you've clearly got their whole attention, and you know, and they are the most lovely people. You know, being listened to, and not having somebody who's trying to jump in and tell you their story, I think makes a really big difference. And the person, as the listener, again, you're learning more, and you're picking up those weak signals that you can use. And the other thing that we tend to do is that we tend to jump to conclusions too quickly. Snowden says, I've never seen the research that he quotes, but he says basically that business analysts, after 2 interviews, have already formed a model in their head in terms of what the problem is and how it looks. And then everything else, they basically stop listening. So don't jump to conclusions. Try and keep an open mind for as long as possible. And silence is we leave, I think they've measured, it varies from country to country, something like 20 milliseconds between one person stopping talking and the next person starting to talk. And essentially what that means, because we actually think more slowly than that, it means we've already decided what we're going to say before the person has finished talking. Radical Candor, anybody read that? Yeah. I mean, again, for me, I mean, this is the bit that helped me in terms of, you know, how to challenge people. And what she says is, you need to, you know, to be a good, I mean, she writes about being a manager, but I think, you know, just in terms of your life in general and your practice, your working practice, you know, learning to challenge people in the right sort of way. But, you know, what she says is, in order to do that, you need to care personally. Otherwise, you're just ending up being an asshole. What's the term she uses? Obnoxious. The polite term is obnoxious aggression. But essentially, you know, caring personally is starting off by do as you would be done by, seeking feedback and trying to get people to be honest with you, being human, listening, respecting. But and an underlying theme of this, which I haven't actually got in the presentation, it's all about building trust. I mean, there was a study done with people with mental health issues that showed that it didn't matter what the therapy technique was, that the thing that delivered the biggest improvement in terms of the mental health of the person being treated was whether that person trusted the therapist. If the therapist had built that trust, then the patient improved. And I think there's a lot to learn from that. How are we doing? One thing that I really liked from Kim Scott, was this get stuff done bit. And the bit I want to pick out is this. And this was another, this is so true. Separate the discussion about what you're going to do or what the problem is from the decision. And this plays to Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow, that basically you need time to go away and think. And if people know that they're going to be listened to and there's going to be time to go away and reflect. And this is, Kim Scott, for those who don't know, was very senior within Apple and Google. I mean, she tells lots of it. It's not she doesn't quote lots of research, but she's got lots of really interesting stories. So even in those high power environments, actually taking a bit of time between doing the discovery bit or doing the discussion bit and then having a separate meeting to actually make the decision, I thought was, and that's certainly the way I say, I want to go away and think about this. Almost there. And this is just a random collection of other things that I found used. Esther Darby, anybody read her? 7, I mean, that's another really lovely book. The bit that, I mean, a lot of what she says I've covered elsewhere, there's a lot of overlap, but the one that I think is really important is honour what is valuable about the past and what is working. Very often, the thing that gets people's backs up is when somebody comes in and says, you're doing it all wrong, what you're doing is rubbish, it's way out of date. And often, there's a lot of good stuff there. And again, a lot of good stuff there that you don't even know about. So start with actually saying, what you're doing, is good work. I'm almost there. Ed Morris, I mean, it's a similar thing. This is back to Ed Morris against strategic doing. What can we do with our current, can we just do some very small stuff with what we've got at the moment? Actually understand the assets and the capabilities that we've got at the moment. Can we do some small stuff? This is Snowden, vector theory of change. Understand, and again, it's similar principle. Understand where you are and see what we can easily change. Do the next best possible thing. Multiple small scale, safe to fail experiments, classic agile stuff. One thing, again, coming back to that adoption curve in terms of dealing with those people who found change difficult. What Morrison talks about is this concept of moving the center of gravity. Don't try and change them. Move where, I mean, a classic example is the smoking ban. We've accepted that now. But it's taken time. So wrap up. So coming back to our brick wall person, what would my answer be now? So I would actively listen to them, go and talk to them about why they don't like the idea. Ask questions. One thing I didn't mention from the poles apart thing is the Socratic method. As well as getting people to explain stuff to them, just keep asking them questions, keep probing. Identify any would this person, they don't like the whole idea. Are there aspects of it that they would like? Can we move? Is there something that they are comfortable with? Build your relationship with them. If they like you, then they're more likely to start agreeing with you. But remain your authentic self. Can we identify a small-scale experiment that you would be comfortable with? And this is from both Ed Morrison and Mary Albeen. Can we identify people in their team that we could go and talk to who they trust and maybe get them to actually, maybe say to them, could we do something small scale within your department? And the key thing, the underlying thing with all of this is these things take time, and one of my theses is that you actually often deliver real value more quickly by going more slowly. By giving people time and listening, you can actually get to a better place more quickly than if you try and push things and then you get a lot of hostility, sabotage, and lots of problems. And I think that's it. Sorry, I've run over.
Even so, to be fair, it's a break after, so you've got as long as you want.
So just to say, if I'm still developing these ideas, if there's anything here that excited you or that you really, again, disagreement is good. if you think what I've said is a load of bollocks, come and tell me, because I will learn from that. And as I say, if you'd like the reading list, I'm happy to put together a list of sources that I use to assemble this.
Perfect. Does anyone have a quick question that they want to ask?
The slides will be going up on the, somebody's already come and hassled me for them.
Can you say anything about finding dissenters? So, obviously they will be kind of suppressed within
That was one of the slides I cut out. I mean,
mean,
in my experience, you've got plenty to deal with already. But just one technique is, people know about Snowden's SenseMaker tool, which is about using stories to go out and get people to tell you stories about what it's like to work in this organization. Tell me a story about how a decision was made in your organization. And then you ask questions once they've told you the story. So it's the person you're talking to that sets the agenda. You're not framing it at all for them. They have a blank sheet of paper. So you discover new stuff, and by asking the questions, you can then start to build maps of the stories. And that gives you, you discover all sorts of things that you never knew about. And the technique he talks about is, how can we get more stories like this? You can look at those maps and say, how can we get more stories like this and fewer like that? It was
something as well to one of your slides,
yeah,
where it said that, and with Agile in mind, try and lean out tests. One of the ways that we flashed out some interesting conversations of dissent at a company I was at before was by introducing diversity and inclusion training, and by saying now this is mandatory in a company that was always open and encouraged open conversations. By introducing new mandatory thing, we suddenly got some dissenting opinions that came up, and we were like, oh, okay, we did not realize that this would be an issue until we forced you all to do it. But that was really important. I think at first it was really scary, like, whoa, you're not allowed to disagree with diversion and inclusion. But actually didn't do that, did a lot of what you recommended, and said why. What is the issue that you've got with it? What the issue actually was, they didn't like being told they had to do it. It wasn't didn't have a problem with the lesson, they had a problem with its mandatory training, and they didn't like the authoritarian tone. So we just had to rephrase but it was really important to unpick. You could just jump to the conclusion that this person was a sexist, racist, didn't want to do any of it. Not at all. They just didn't want to be told how to do it. So I think by doing those tests, it does flush it out sometimes, as long as you're willing to listen afterwards.
It's better to know the bad news.
It was better to flush it out than have it hidden, like you said, because that was,
Well, thank you. You've been a lovely audience. So